30-foot waves are hammering the ship's hull. Cold water is pouring through the ceilings, flooding corridors and pooling across cabin floors. Every other cruise ship in the region has already moved out of the storm's path, but the Norwegian Breakaway sailed straight into it. What's worse, the captain hasn't said a word. So how did 4,000 passengers end up in the middle of a cruise nightmare? It wasn't a freak accident. Here's exactly what happened. On New Year's Eve 2017, Cristina Mendez was taking a break with her family, including her 20-year-old autistic son and 6-year-old daughter. They couldn't have been more exciting to get to the Caribbean and soak up some winter sun. The first few days were fine. New Year's came and went as the ship sailed south to the warm Bahamas. Then on January 2nd, the Breakaway stopped at Great Stirrup Cay, Norwegian Cruise Line's private island, and the passengers went ashore on small tender boats. The weather was calm at first, but as the day wore on, the water got choppier and the wind picked up. By the time the tenders were bringing people back to the ship, things were getting rough. Most passengers probably didn't think much of it. What they didn't know was that meteorologists had been sounding alarms for days. 2 days before the Norwegian Breakaway left the Bahamas, the National Weather Service's Ocean Prediction Center had put out a warning that said very dangerous Atlantic marine conditions were expected later that week. By the morning of January 3rd, the warnings got more specific. The forecast now described a powerful storm with hurricane-force winds moving up the coast. Winds over 90 miles per hour, with seas reaching 33 feet and waves taller than a 3-story building. The storm was named Winter Storm Grayson, and the most dangerous part of it was what forecasters call a bomb cyclone. Its pressure dropped so fast, it basically turned into a winter hurricane. The Norwegian Breakaway isn't a small ship. At over 1,070 feet long, it's the kind of vessel where you forget you're at sea, with restaurants, pools, and entertainment decks. Most of the time, the ocean's just the backdrop. But even a ship that big can't take on the ocean at its most violent. Storms this strong shut down entire cities, let alone cruise liners. Other ships saw the same forecasts and kept to the south. Royal Caribbean, for example, confirmed its vessels were safely away from the storm when it hit. But the cruise liner decided to make a different choice. More than 12 hours after that warning had been issued, at around 6 p.m., the Norwegian Breakaway left the Bahamas and headed north toward New York and the storm. The passengers had no idea. Some noticed the water getting rougher and the wind picking up, but the crew wasn't telling anyone what the ship was about to sail into. One later recalled, "You really felt as though you were left unknowing and in the dark." A weather analyst later looked at the ship's route and said it was clear the cruise liner had decided to push through the storm rather than being caught off guard. The ship may have tried to skirt the western edge to dodge the worst of it, but the computer models all showed hurricane-force winds on both sides of the storm. There was no good path through. The Breakaway was heading north, and so was the storm. On the next day, the ocean changed. Swells grew and the ship started to get pushed around violently. People began to get seasick. The crew tried to carry on as normal, but the ship was pitching and rolling so violently that when they tried to serve dinner, the plates, glasses, and everything else slid off the tables and smashed onto the floor. Their ship leaned so far to one side that walking through the hallways felt like climbing a hill. One passenger later said that, depending on where you were, you felt as though you were climbing because the ship was literally on its side. Then the water started getting in. It poured from the ceilings, leaked through the elevator shafts, and came through the sliding glass doors of the balcony cabins. Carpets were becoming soaked through, and cold water was pouring across the floors. Some guests had a full 2 inches of flooding in the rooms. For Cristina Mendez and her family, their cabin turned into something out of a nightmare.
Water started leaking, and then it became so cold that we had popsicles inside our rooms. Flooding in the bathroom because we were at a tilt, the water just gushed out.
There was broken glass everywhere, and the showers were exploding. People couldn't walk down an aisle without falling. And then night fell. That's when it got really bad. Passengers were thrown from their beds. One woman described being launched across her cabin.
I flew across the room, landed in the bathroom, and then I got up, I got into my bed, and I said a prayer. That's how I felt that night.
Another passenger woke to the sound of everything crashing off the shelves and glasses shattering in the dark. But incredibly, no announcement had been made. As the storm raged and the water poured in, the captain said almost nothing. When he did speak, it was the same message over and over.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are in rough seas and we are optimizing our speed and course to minimize the movement of the ship.
Cristina said the captain never told them where they were, how far from New York, or how fast they were going. The updates were sporadic and vague. One guest put it bluntly.
The captain should have told us a little more. He just kept saying, oh, we're in rough seas. Well, no crap, we're in rough seas.
So the passengers were left to figure it out for themselves. And when they did, it terrified them. Many of them left their rooms and went to the common areas. Dozens gathered in the ship's atrium and tried to sleep on the cold floor. Some passengers were walking the hallways in life jackets. Others were sleeping in the corridors because the water had made their rooms uninhabitable. One described, people in the atrium just kind of huddled up in the fetal position with blankets, just sheer panic. People were crying while everyone was throwing up. It was a nightmare. It was so tilted I was shaking. Another passenger didn't think he'd make it through the night. I was holding on for dear life. I honestly wasn't sure we were going to make it through the night. The boat was tilted like crazy. The swells reached up to 30 feet. From the second-story dining room, passengers could see massive gray waves crashing against the hull. A camera at the bow captured what the ship was plowing into. At one point, the Breakaway passed another Norwegian vessel, the Gem, headed in the opposite direction. As the storm went on, children began asking their parents if they were going to die. They responded that everything would be all right, but privately, they couldn't be sure. The storm lasted around 2 days, but on board the ship, it felt like forever. Cristina's kids saw things no child on a vacation cruise should see, like everyone sick everywhere and a lady falling from the ceiling. The crew tried to help. One passenger praised them for keeping it together even when they were clearly scared themselves. But brave faces from the crew couldn't change what was happening. 4,000 people were trapped on a ship in the middle of a winter hurricane, and nobody had told them it was coming. Eventually, the storm passed, and the Breakaway limped toward New York. And when it finally pulled into port, the ship told its own story. Thick ice had built up on the sides of the hull, and the lifeboats were damaged. Passengers stumbled off the ship, some still in shock. One guest summed up what many were feeling. I thought I'd never be in a situation where I would say that's the scariest moment of my life. This was the worst moment of my life. Weeks after the cruise, Cristina's kids were still having nightmares. Her autistic son was still suffering from anxiety. Norwegian Cruise Line's first public statement only apologized for the delay to the next cruise's embarkation. The Breakaway's late arrival delayed the next scheduled trip, so Norwegian pushed the departure back a day. Those new guests got a day's refund, but there was nothing for the passengers who just weathered the storm. They later released a second statement. During the early morning hours of January 4th, Norwegian Breakaway encountered stronger than forecasted weather conditions due to Winter Storm Grayson during the trip's return to New York from the Bahamas. All guests and crew are safe. We sincerely apologize to our guests for these stronger than expected weather conditions and any resulting discomfort they may have experienced. Yet, the National Weather Service had been warning about hurricane-force winds and 33-foot seas for days before the ship left the Bahamas. The cruise line wouldn't appear on camera and wouldn't say who makes the final call to sail when storms have been forecasted. What they did offer the passengers was an apology letter and a 25% off voucher for a future holiday. There was no explanation as to why they sailed through a bomb cyclone. But there is a predominant theory as to why Norwegian company chose to take the risk. The ship was at the tail end of its voyage, and a new 2-week trip was scheduled to depart from New York as soon as the Breakaway got back. If the Breakaway delayed its return, that next cruise would be disrupted, and the financial hit would be significant. The Coast Guard weighed in on who's responsible in a situation like this. They said restrictions can be placed on specific ports due to storms, but unless the port actually closes, the call to sail through bad weather is left to the captain. And in this case, the port didn't close. Professional mariners who discussed the incident pointed out that going around a storm that large would have meant a delay of days, not hours. They understood the commercial pressure, but they also said the storm was very well forecasted. One of them quoted an old saying from the industry: "The schedule is flexible, the ship is not." Some of the flooding may have had other causes too. The pools on the upper decks likely weren't drained out before the storm. With the ship rolling, tons of pool water could have spilled and poured down the staircases to the lower decks. Some water may have also come through balcony doors that passengers opened and couldn't close again. But those details didn't answer the real question. Why was the ship there at all? About a year later, roughly 200 passengers filed a lawsuit against Norwegian Cruise Line in federal court. They accused them of negligence for knowingly sailing into the storm. They said the conditions on board caused them to genuinely fear for their lives. In May 2019, the case was dismissed without prejudice. Norwegian Cruise Line declined to comment, but they have since agreed to a settlement with some of the passengers, according to some reports. 4,000 passengers boarded the Norwegian Breakaway, looking forward to a week of fun, sunshine, and fulfilled lifelong dreams. They came home with nightmares. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing. It's helping a lot.